The Duppy, the Caribbean spirit that lives among the dead in the Caribbean. The dead don't rest, they walk, they watch, and they can be commanded to attack the living. Long before European investigators began cataloging reports of spectral phenomena with Victorian sensibilities, and long before American parapsychologists applied scientific frameworks to hauntings, the people of the Caribbean had already established a functional relationship with their dead. They called these entities Duppies, spirits of deceased persons who persist in the physical world, capable of interaction with the living in ways that range from protective to profoundly dangerous. This is not the folklore of a vanished culture or the superstition of an isolated community. This is a living tradition, documented across centuries, recorded in academic fieldwork, referenced in colonial court records, and integrated into the daily spiritual practice of Caribbean communities from the 18th century to the present day. The word Duppy originates primarily from Jamaican documentation, but the concept spans the Caribbean archipelago. Different islands maintain different names for essentially the same category of being, a spirit of the dead that has not departed fully from the realm of the living, that maintains agency and intention, and that occupies specific locations in the physical landscape. The Duppy is not the Western ghost, drifting through abandoned houses in search of resolution for earthly trauma. The Duppy is not primarily a manifestation of unfinished business or a remnant psychic impression left behind by violent emotion. The Duppy is an entity with its own agenda, its own capacity for relationship, both cooperative and hostile with living people, and its own permanent place in the social and spiritual fabric of Caribbean life. This distinction matters. In Western paranormal investigation, the ghost represents an anomaly, something that should not exist according to materialist worldviews, something to be studied or dismissed or exorcised. In Caribbean spiritual tradition, the Duppy represents a category of being, an expected part of reality that requires management rather than elimination. The dead are not gone, they are present, they are active, and the living must know how to navigate that presence. The foundational academic documentation of the Duppy tradition comes from Zora Neale Hurston, the American anthropologist and writer who conducted extensive fieldwork in Jamaica and Haiti between 1936 and 1937. Her book, Tell My Horse, represents the first systematic Western scholarly attempt to document Caribbean spiritual practices from the inside, through participant observation rather than colonial dismissal. Hurston's documentation of the Duppy describes an entity that is understood by Jamaican practitioners as the spirit of a deceased person that remains near the grave for a period after death. Some Duppies move on, some remain indefinitely. The factors that determine which Duppies remain and which depart are not random. They involve the circumstances of death, the relationships the deceased maintained in life, and the spiritual practices performed by the living in the period immediately following death. Hurston's work was not conducted in isolation. Subsequent folklorists and anthropologists working in Jamaica and the broader Caribbean across the decades following her fieldwork confirmed the continuity of the tradition. The Duppy was not a relic of the past, fading under the pressure of modernization. It was a living spiritual reality, adapting in form but consistent in substance. The tradition maintained specific knowledge about where Duppies are found, when they are most active, and how they can be managed or avoided. The locations associated with Duppies are precise. The grave of the deceased remains the primary site where a Duppy can be encountered, particularly in the period immediately following death. Certain trees hold significance as Duppy habitations. The cotton tree appears most prominently in Jamaican documentation as a tree associated with spiritual presence, a location where Duppies gather or reside. Crossroads represent another significant location, consistent with African diaspora spiritual traditions that recognize crossroads as liminal spaces where the boundaries between worlds grow thin. These are not abstract theological concepts. These are practical instructions for navigating physical space in communities where the Duppy tradition remains active. The times when Duppies are most active follow specific patterns. Midnight represents the peak of Duppy activity. The period just before dawn also holds significance as a dangerous time for encounters. These temporal markers create a structure of caution, a framework within which people in Caribbean communities organize their movements and their protective practices. The danger posed by Duppies is documented as real and variable. An unprepared encounter with a Duppy, an encounter without the protective practices the tradition prescribes, can result in illness, psychological disturbance, or even death. The mechanisms of this harm are understood within the tradition as spiritual attack, the capacity of a Duppy to affect the living person's health and mental state through supernatural means. But the most dangerous form of Duppy encounter is not random, it is directed. Caribbean spiritual traditions include practitioners with the knowledge and skill to manipulate Duppies, to direct them against specific targets with specific intentions. This practice is documented not only in oral tradition and anthropological fieldwork, but in legal records. Colonial court documents from various Caribbean territories include cases in which individuals brought grievances involving Duppy manipulation, accusations that spiritual practitioners had been hired to send a Duppy against a particular person, resulting in illness, madness, or death. These court cases represent extraordinary documentation of the tradition's real-world behavioral consequences. People took the threat of Duppy attack seriously enough to seek legal remedy. Courts were required to respond to these accusations within legal frameworks that had no category for supernatural grievance, creating a documentary record that confirms the social reality of the tradition even as it reveals the cultural collision between Caribbean spiritual practice and colonial legal systems. The existence of these court cases demonstrates that the Duppy tradition was not merely folklore or metaphor. It was a framework through which real social conflicts were understood and addressed. Communities believed that spiritual practitioners could direct Duppies against specific people with measurable results. Whether those results were caused by supernatural forces or by the psychological and social effects of belief becomes less relevant than the documented fact that the tradition shaped behavior, motivated legal action, and structured community relationships across centuries. The removal of a Duppy from a location or the protection of a person from Duppy attack involves specific practices documented consistently across the tradition. Rum appears frequently as a substance used in protective and placating rituals. Certain plants hold significance for their protective properties. Specific prayer formulae, often blending Christian elements with African-derived spiritual practices, are employed by those who know them. And spiritual authorities, practitioners with recognized skill in managing relationships between the living and the dead, are engaged when situations require intervention beyond what ordinary protective practices can accomplish. The tradition is specific about what works and what does not work. This specificity reflects practical knowledge accumulated across generations, knowledge tested by experience rather than derived from theological speculation. The people who maintain the Duppy tradition are not engaged in abstract spiritual philosophy. They are managing concrete problems in daily life, problems that require concrete solutions. The legacy of the Duppy tradition extends far beyond its documentation in academic texts or its appearance in court records. The Duppy represents the most important supernatural entity in the Caribbean for understanding how African diaspora communities maintain their relationship to their own dead across the devastation of the slave trade and the ongoing pressures of colonialism. The tradition reflects a distinctive synthesis: West African concepts of ancestor relationship, adapted to Caribbean conditions, shaped by the specific spiritual needs of communities that survived by refusing to sever their connection to the dead. The Duppy is not the Western ghost, eternally searching for peace or justice. It is not the Haitian zombie, stripped of will and enslaved again in death. It is something distinctively Caribbean, familiar to those who grew up within the tradition, requiring management rather than exorcism, integrated into the landscape rather than feared as an aberration. For communities that maintain the tradition, the Duppy is not primarily frightening. It is familiar, it is expected. It is part of the world that requires navigation with knowledge and respect, just as one navigates any other persistent reality. The fear comes not from the existence of Duppies, but from encounters without preparation, from the manipulation of Duppies by those with hostile intent, from the violation of the proper relationship between the living and the dead. The tradition persists. Researchers continue to document Duppy beliefs and practices in contemporary Caribbean communities, finding adaptations in form but continuity in substance. The dead are still present, they are still active, and the living still maintain the knowledge necessary to manage that presence. If you found this case compelling, subscribe to Vanishing Roads for more documented paranormal investigations from around the world. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented case files. All events reference real investigations and reported incidents.